June 4, 1942, and Lieutenant John Walter sat in the cramped cockpit of his Dauntless dive bomber on the pitching deck of USS Enterprise, watching the deck crew prepare the aircraft for launch while trying to control the anxiety that was making his hands tremble slightly on the control column. Around him, the Carrier Air Group was preparing for the most important mission of the war so far, 54 aircraft from Enterprise alone getting ready to find and destroy the Japanese carrier fleet that was somewhere northwest of Midway Island, and everyone knew that the outcome of this battle could determine the course of the entire Pacific War for years to come. Walter was 25 years old, a naval aviator from Iowa who had learned to fly in crop dusters on his family's farm before joining the Navy in 1939 when war in Europe convinced him that America would eventually be dragged into the conflict whether it wanted to be or not. He had survived the early months of the war when everything seemed to go wrong for the Americans, when Wake Island fell and the Philippines collapsed and Japanese forces seemed unstoppable in their conquest of the Pacific. But intelligence reports suggested that this time would be different, that American code breakers had deciphered Japanese communications and knew exactly where the enemy fleet would be, giving the Americans a chance to set up an ambush that could change the strategic balance. If everything went according to plan. His rear gunner was aviation radioman 3rd Class Tommy Brennan, a wiry 20-year-old kid from Brooklyn who handled the twin .30 caliber machine guns mounted in the rear cockpit and operated the radio that would be their only link to the carrier if they ran into trouble. They had been flying together for 8 months, long enough to develop the kind of trust that comes from shared danger and mutual dependence, and Walter knew that Brennan would watch his back no matter what happened during this mission, just as Walter would do everything possible to get them both back to the carrier alive. The intelligence breakthrough that had made this ambush possible was one of the great secrets of the war. American cryptanalysts having broken the Japanese naval code and intercepted messages revealing that Admiral Yamamoto was planning a major operation against Midway Island as part of a strategy to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle where Japan's numerical superiority would allow them to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. The Japanese believed that American carriers were still recovering from the Battle of Coral Sea and wouldn't be able to respond in time. But they were wrong because Yorktown had been rushed through repairs that should have taken months but were completed in just 72 hours of round-the-clock work by thousands of shipyard workers who understood what was at stake. The briefing that morning had been intense and detailed, Admiral Fletcher laying out the tactical situation with a clarity that left no doubt about what was at stake. The Japanese were sending 4 fleet carriers to attack Midway, veteran ships named Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu with experienced air crews who had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier and had been rampaging across the Pacific ever since, seemingly invincible in their superiority over anything the Americans could put up against them. These weren't just ordinary carriers, they were the elite of the Japanese Navy, carrying the best pilots who had trained for years before the war began and had accumulated combat experience that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. But American code breakers had given the Navy advance warning of Japanese plans, allowing Admirals Fletcher and Spruance to position their carriers northeast of Midway where they could launch a strike against the Japanese fleet at the moment when it was most vulnerable, with its aircraft either on deck being refueled and rearmed or just landing after attacking Midway and unable to respond to an American attack. The timing would be critical, everything depending on finding the Japanese carriers during that narrow window when they were caught between operations and couldn't effectively defend themselves or launch a counterstrike against the American fleet. The launch was delayed by coordination problems as aircraft from different carriers tried to synchronize their attacks so that fighters and torpedo bombers and dive bombers would all arrive over the Japanese fleet at the same time, overwhelming the defenses through sheer numbers rather than allowing the enemy to defeat each group separately. Walter watched in growing frustration as precious minutes ticked away while staff officers argued about timing and approach routes, knowing that every delay gave the Japanese more time to recover their aircraft and launch their own strike against the American carriers that were now vulnerable to discovery and attack. When Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet launched without waiting for fighter escort, Walter felt a sick certainty that those slow, obsolete devastators were heading toward their doom. The ancient aircraft loaded with torpedoes that made them even slower and less maneuverable than usual, while Japanese Zero fighters were among the most agile and deadly interceptors in the world. The decision to launch without coordination seemed like madness, but the squadron commander had judged that waiting any longer would mean missing the window of opportunity entirely, and he chose to attack alone rather than not attack at all, knowing it would probably cost him his life and the lives of all his men. Finally, the order came to launch aircraft, and Walter's Dauntless rolled down Enterprise's flight deck with its engine roaring at full power, the heavy bomb load making the aircraft sluggish as it struggled to gain altitude in the humid tropical air. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers formed up in loose formation under the command of Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, an experienced pilot whose calm competence inspired confidence in men who were about to fly into combat against a numerically superior enemy that had never been defeated in a carrier-to-carrier engagement. McClusky had a reputation for being unflappable under pressure, exactly the kind of leader you wanted when heading into the most important battle of the war. The flight northwest toward the expected location of the Japanese fleet was tense, every man scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft while also watching his fuel gauge tick steadily downward because the Dauntless had limited range when loaded with a 1,000-pound bomb, and if they didn't find the carriers soon they would have to either ditch in the ocean or jettison their bombs and return to Enterprise having accomplished nothing. Walter checked his instruments constantly, calculating fuel consumption and time to target and distance to safety, trying to keep his mind focused on the technical aspects of flying rather than thinking about what would happen when they actually found the enemy and had to dive through anti-aircraft fire that would be trying to kill them with every passing second. They reached the coordinates where intelligence had predicted the Japanese fleet would be and found nothing except empty ocean stretching to the horizon in every direction, no ships visible despite perfect visibility that should have allowed them to see for dozens of miles. McClusky circled the area while his pilots burned precious fuel, searching desperately for any sign of the enemy fleet that had to be somewhere nearby but remained frustratingly invisible, and Walter felt panic starting to rise as he realized they were approaching the point of no return beyond which they wouldn't have enough fuel to make it back to Enterprise even if they turned around immediately. The tension in the cockpit was unbearable as minutes ticked by with no sign of the Japanese fleet, fuel gauges dropping toward the point where return would be impossible, and they would all be committed to either finding the enemy or ditching in the ocean when their fuel ran out. Walter could hear Brennan's breathing over the intercom, rapid and shallow with the same anxiety that was making Walter's own heart pound in his chest, both of them knowing that their lives depended on McClusky's navigation and judgment, hoping that the squadron commander knew what he was doing because if he was wrong they were all going to die in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with nobody to rescue them and no way to complete their mission. Then Brennan shouted something over the intercom and pointed toward the northwest, where a lone Japanese destroyer was moving at high speed trailing a distinctive wake that suggested it was trying to catch up with something larger, and McClusky made the instant decision to follow that destroyer on the assumption that it was heading toward the main fleet. It was pure guesswork, intuition rather than calculation, but experienced pilots develop an instinct for these things and McClusky trusted his judgment enough to bet all their lives on it, leading the formation northwest past the point where return to Enterprise was no longer possible, and they were committed to either finding the carriers or ditching in the ocean when their fuel ran out. 10 minutes later, Brennan shouted again, and this time Walter saw what he was pointing at. A cluster of ships spread across the ocean like toys in a bathtub, 4 aircraft carriers surrounded by cruisers and destroyers in a defensive formation that should have made them nearly invulnerable to attack except for one critical factor. The carriers had their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, bombs and torpedoes and fuel hoses scattered across the decks in a configuration that would turn each ship into a massive bomb if it was hit in the right place. And Walter realized they had arrived at precisely the moment when the Japanese were most vulnerable, caught between recovering their Midway strike and preparing to launch against the American carriers. The scene below was exactly what American planners had hoped for but hardly dared to expect: Japanese carriers in the middle of switching out their ordnance from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes because they had just received word that American carriers were in the area and needed to be dealt with immediately. This process of rearming aircraft was time-consuming and left the carriers extremely vulnerable because bombs and torpedoes were sitting on the flight decks instead of safely stored below, and fuel lines were connected to aircraft waiting to be launched, creating a situation where one hit in the right place could trigger a chain reaction of explosions that would destroy the entire ship. McClusky wasted no time, immediately deploying his squadrons to attack different carriers so that the Japanese would have to divide their anti-aircraft fire rather than concentrating it against a single target. Walter's section was assigned to attack the carrier that appeared to be the fleet flagship based on the number of signal flags flying from its masts, later identified as Akagi, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was considered one of the most powerful warships in the Japanese Navy. The idea of attacking such a formidable target was terrifying, but Walter pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the technical aspects of his attack run, knowing that hesitation or fear would only get him killed. The Japanese seemed unaware of the American dive bombers circling overhead at 14,000 feet, their attention focused on the torpedo bombers that were making their suicidal low-level attacks from different directions, drawing the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level where they couldn't interfere with dive bombers attacking from high altitude. This was exactly what the torpedo squadrons had hoped to accomplish, even though most of them knew they wouldn't survive to see the results of their sacrifice. And Walter felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt knowing that those brave men were dying to give him and his squadron mates the opportunity to strike a decisive blow. Walter rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet, the wind screaming past the canopy as the aircraft accelerated toward terminal velocity while tracers from Japanese anti-aircraft guns reached up toward him like deadly fingers trying to pluck him from the sky. The carrier grew larger in his sight as he plummeted toward it, his airspeed indicator showing speeds that would tear the wings off his aircraft if he maintained them too long, his altimeter unwinding so fast that the numbers blurred together. And he forced himself to stay calm and wait for the exact right moment to release his bomb and pull out of the dive before he flew into the ocean or was hit by anti-aircraft fire that was growing thicker as he descended. The anti-aircraft fire was intense beyond anything he had experienced in training, shells exploding all around him creating black puffs of smoke that indicated near misses, while tracers from lighter guns drew lines of fire through the air that seemed impossible to avoid. Walter jinked his aircraft left and right in small unpredictable movements that made it harder for gunners to track him, but there was only so much maneuvering you could do in a dive without losing sight of your target or throwing off your bombing solution, and he knew that luck would play as big a role as skill in determining whether he survived the next 30 seconds. At 1,500 feet, he pulled the release handle and felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds of high explosive separated from the belly and fell toward the carrier's deck, and then he was pulling back on the stick with all his strength, the G-forces pushing him down into his seat so hard that his vision grayed at the edges and he could barely maintain consciousness. The Dauntless was built tough and it responded to his control inputs, pulling out of the dive at wave-top level and accelerating away from the carrier while Brennan in the rear seat reported that their bomb had hit near the carrier's island, exactly where fuel and ordnance were stored. Walter didn't see what happened next because he was too busy flying at full power away from the Japanese fleet, jinxing and weaving to avoid the anti-aircraft fire that was still tracking him, but Brennan had a perfect view as Akagi erupted in flames. Multiple bomb hits from other dive bombers striking within seconds of each other, and turning the carrier's deck into an inferno as stored ammunition and fuel ignited in a series of explosions that could be seen for miles. The ship's captain tried to maintain control and save his vessel, but the fires were spreading too fast and the damage was too extensive, secondary explosions ripping through the hangar deck as aircraft and ordnance detonated in chain reactions that no damage control efforts could contain. Kaga suffered the same fate moments later, American dive bombers hitting it with at least 4 bombs that started fires which quickly spread out of control, the carrier's wooden flight deck burning fiercely while ammunition magazines began to cook off and explode, adding to the destruction. Soria was hit by 3 bombs within the span of 2 minutes, the strikes occurring so close together that they might have come from the same dive bomber making multiple passes. And within minutes all 3 carriers were burning wrecks that would never fight again, their crews abandoning ship as the fires reached the fuel storage tanks and created explosions that lifted entire sections of deck into the air. The cost of this success had been horrific for the American torpedo squadrons that had attacked first without fighter escort or dive bomber support, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet having been completely wiped out with only one survivor out of 30 aircrewmen. Their slow, obsolete aircraft having been easy meat for Japanese Zero fighters that had shot them down one after another without any of them even getting close enough to launch their torpedoes. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown had suffered similar losses, and Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise had been decimated as well, the three squadrons combined losing over 80% of their aircraft and crews in attacks that accomplished nothing tactically but drew Japanese fighters away from altitude where they could have intercepted the dive bombers. The flight back to Enterprise was an exercise in fuel management and navigation, Walter nursing his damaged aircraft along at the most economical airspeed while constantly calculating whether they had enough fuel to make it back to the carrier, which was moving at high speed to avoid Japanese attacks and might not be where they expected it to be when they arrived. Other aircraft in the formation were in even worse shape, some trailing smoke from battle damage, others with wounded crewmen who needed immediate medical attention, but there was nothing anyone could do except keep flying and hope that their fuel lasted long enough to reach the fleet. Several aircraft ran out of fuel before reaching the carriers and had to ditch in the ocean, their crews hoping to be picked up by rescue submarines or destroyers that were stationed along the return route for exactly this purpose. Walter watched two Dauntless splash down within sight of Enterprise, both crews escaping their sinking aircraft and deploying life rafts, and he said a silent prayer that they would be recovered before sharks or exposure killed them because the Pacific Ocean was a harsh environment that didn't forgive mistakes or bad luck. They landed on Enterprise with less than 10 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for one more circuit of the landing pattern, and Walter felt the tension drain out of him as the tailhook caught the arresting wire and slammed them to a halt on the carrier's deck. Deck crew were already pushing his aircraft forward to clear the landing area for the next plane, but Walter sat in the cockpit for a moment just breathing and trying to process what they had just accomplished. The knowledge that they had struck a decisive blow against the Japanese fleet not yet feeling real despite the evidence of his own eyes. The battle wasn't over, the fourth Japanese carrier Hiria having survived the initial American attack because it had been separated from the main formation and wasn't discovered until later. Hiria launched a strike against the American carriers that would severely damage Yorktown, hitting her with bombs and torpedoes that left her dead in the water and eventually led to her being sunk by a Japanese submarine several days later. But American dive bombers would find and destroy Hiria later that afternoon, Walter flying in that second strike mission despite his exhaustion because every available aircraft was needed to ensure that no Japanese carriers escaped to threaten the American fleet. The attack on Hiria was similar to the morning strike, dive bombers coming in from high altitude while the carrier was recovering aircraft from its strike against Yorktown, catching it at another vulnerable moment when the deck was crowded with aircraft and ordnance. Walter's bomb hit near the forward elevator, starting fires that quickly spread through the ship, and by evening Hiria was burning out of control just like her three sister ships, all four Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor now sinking or sunk in a single day of battle that had cost Japan its offensive capability in the Pacific. The price had been heavy on both sides, over 3,000 Japanese sailors dead including many experienced carrier aircrew who could never be replaced, while American losses included Yorktown and over 300 aircrew killed including the entire Torpedo Squadron 8 that had sacrificed themselves to draw Japanese fighters down to sea level where they couldn't interfere with the dive bomber attacks. Walter attended the memorial service for Torpedo Squadron 8 feeling like a fraud because he and his squadron mates had survived while those brave men had flown to certain death knowing they probably wouldn't survive but attacking anyway because their duty required it. The strategic consequences of Midway became clear over the following months as Japan found itself unable to replace the carriers and experienced aircrew they had lost, their offensive operations grinding to a halt while American shipyards began producing new carriers at a rate that Japan couldn't possibly match. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day was a catastrophe from which the Japanese Navy never recovered, their margin of superiority having been wiped out in the span of a few hours by American pilots who had been outnumbered and outmatched but had won through courage and sacrifice and a little bit of luck at the crucial moment. Walter flew many more combat missions during the war, participating in strikes against Japanese positions across the Pacific and eventually being promoted to squadron commander, but nothing in his subsequent service compared to the intensity and importance of that day at Midway when the fate of the Pacific War had hung in the balance. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that day, though he always felt the real heroes were the men of the torpedo squadrons who had died without accomplishing anything tactically but whose sacrifice had made the dive bomber attacks possible. The years following Midway would prove just how decisive that single day of battle had been, the Japanese never again mounting a major carrier offensive and instead being forced into an increasingly desperate defensive strategy as American industrial might began producing ships and aircraft at a rate that made ultimate Allied victory inevitable. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented not just ships but irreplaceable institutional knowledge and combat experience that took years to develop and couldn't be recreated no matter how many new carriers Japan built, because the veteran pilots and aircrew who had made those carriers so effective were gone forever, killed in the sinking ships or in the months of fighting that preceded Midway. Walter understood this better than most, having seen firsthand how even small advantages in pilot skill and experience could make the difference between success and failure in combat, and he knew that losing hundreds of Japan's best naval aviators in a single day was a blow from which they could never fully recover. The new pilots who replaced those losses might be brave and dedicated, but they lacked the thousands of hours of training and combat experience that separated truly elite aircrew from merely competent ones. And this experience gap would only widen as the war progressed and American training programs continued to produce skilled pilots while Japanese training infrastructure crumbled under the pressure of constant combat and resource shortages. The Battle of Midway also vindicated the intelligence officers and code breakers who had warned of the Japanese attack, their work having provided the crucial advance warning that allowed American carriers to be in position for the ambush. Without that intelligence breakthrough, the American carriers might have been caught by surprise and destroyed, giving Japan the decisive victory they sought and potentially extending the war by years. Walter made a point of thanking the intelligence officers he met after the battle, knowing that their contributions had been just as important as anything the pilots had done, even though their work would remain classified for decades and they would receive none of the public recognition that combat veterans enjoyed. Brennan survived the war as well, flying with Walter throughout his entire combat tour and eventually being decorated for his own actions during numerous engagements where his accurate gunnery had saved their aircraft from enemy fighters that tried to attack from behind. The bond between pilot and gunner was something civilians could never fully understand, a trust that came from knowing your life depended on the man in the other seat doing his job perfectly every single time. And when they parted ways after the war, they maintained a correspondence that lasted until Brennan's death in 1992. Letters that mostly talked about mundane civilian life but occasionally touched on shared memories from a time when they had been young men fighting for their country's survival. The legacy of Midway extended beyond just the military victory, becoming a symbol of American determination and capability that helped boost morale at a time when good news from the Pacific was rare and precious. The victory proved that American forces could defeat the Japanese in a fair fight, dispelling the myth of Japanese invincibility that had taken hold after Pearl Harbor, and the string of defeats that followed. Walter saw this shift in attitude when he returned to the United States on leave several months after Midway, civilians who had been despondent about the war now expressing confidence that ultimate victory was possible. And he realized that the battle had accomplished something beyond just sinking 4 carriers by giving Americans hope that they could win this war. After the war, Walter returned to Iowa and took over his family's farm, occasionally flying for pleasure but never talking much about his combat experiences except with other pilots who understood what it meant to risk your life in combat. He married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 4 children who grew up hearing stories about how their father had flown in the war but never really understanding what that meant until they were adults themselves with children of their own. He attended annual reunions with other Midway veterans, gatherings that grew smaller each year as age and illness took their toll, old men remembering a day when they had been young and had helped change the course of history through courage and skill and more than a little luck. The nightmares about the battle never entirely went away, Walter waking up sometimes in the middle of the night with his heart pounding and sweat soaking his sheets, reliving that 70-degree dive through anti-aircraft fire or seeing again the faces of friends who hadn't made it back from missions over Japanese-held islands. His wife learned not to wake him during these episodes, letting him work through the memories on his own because forcing him to talk about it only made things worse, and gradually over the decades the nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared completely because some experiences are too intense to ever fully process or put behind you. John Walter passed away in 2005 at the age of 88, one of the last surviving pilots from the Battle of Midway, his funeral attended by Navy representatives who came to honor a man whose skill and courage had helped win a battle that many historians consider the turning point of the Pacific War. His coffin was draped with an American flag and carried by active-duty naval aviators who understood that their profession had been shaped by men like Walter. And when taps was played over his grave, there were tears on the faces of hardened combat veterans who knew exactly what he had sacrificed and accomplished during those terrible years when the world's freedom hung in the balance, and individual acts of heroism made all the difference.